Bom, bom dia a todos. Dando prosseguimento às conferências principais do nosso 16º Encontro de Estudos das Origens da Filosofia Contemporânea. Hoje nós contamos com a conferência do professor Tim Crane, agora na parte da manhã, e como de costume também, então na parte da tarde, as demais conferências e, por fim, as sessões de comunicação. Também como de praxe, o professor Tim Crane vai fazer a sua conferência, seguido depois pelos comentários do professor Leclerc. Excepcionalmente, hoje, nós, por questões de tempo, inclusive do professor Tim Crane, nós não teremos a nossa sessão aberta de questões por parte da audiência, tudo bem? Então, excepcionalmente hoje, vamos ter apenas os comentários e o debate entre o professor Tim Crane e o professor Leclerc. Well, good morning, you all. Professor Tim Crane, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you here. Professor Tim Crane is professor at CEU, but also the director of research of the Austrian Cluster of Excellence. And as you know, he is author of several papers and books. It's a very accomplished scholar. And once again, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you here. Thank you so very much, Professor Crane. The floor is yours. Just remembering that afterwards, we will have some comments by Professor Andrea Leclerc. And afterwards, you can, of course, exchange some thoughts. And thank you so very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for this invitation. I would have loved to have been there in person, but it wasn't possible. So maybe some other time in the future. But it's an honor to be speaking here in this what seems to me a very important project. And my talk today is very much on the question of the origins of contemporary philosophy, and particularly the analytic continental distinction. I'm going to make 6 broad points. First of all, I'm going to just introduce my subject matter. I will then say something about the labels, the words, analytic and continental. Then I will ask whether this is a philosophical distinction, and I'll say, broadly speaking, it isn't. But there is a real distinction there, and in the next part I will say what I think the distinction is, or even though it's not strictly speaking philosophical. Then finally I will add some comments about the role of history of philosophy in philosophy, which I see as a sort of I see this talk as a instance of how to think about the history of philosophy and how it helps us with philosophical understanding. So Hobbes once said about Descartes' meditations that this was all reheated cabbage, and reheated cabbage is what a lot of philosophy is. The cabbage gets reheated over time, and anyone who is familiar with the cuisine of Central Europe will know that actually cabbage gets better when it's reheated. So it's not so good when you first cook it, and then a few days later it's even better. So in that hope, I'm going to reheat some cabbage here. And the 2 pieces of cabbage I want to reheat are what is the relevance of the history of philosophy to philosophy as such. This is something that's concerned me since I was a graduate student, because I was educated very much in the culture of thinking that philosophy was one thing, the history of philosophy another, and that the history of philosophy was no more relevant to philosophy than the history of physics was to physics. So if you study physics, you don't start with Newton or Galileo, you start with some principles. And this was the way my teachers thought about philosophy. I didn't accept that view of my teachers, so I had to come to another understanding of the relationship of history of philosophy to philosophy. Now, my second question is, what's the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy? And my direct aim is to answer that question as an example of the way to think about question 1. So first, I'm going to mostly be concerned with question 2, but at the end of my talk, I will say something about question 1. So the analytic and the continental, what is this distinction? Is it real? Where does it come from? What is the extension of the distinction? What its intention? What things is it distinguishing, and what are the concepts behind the distinction? Now, in England, we have this concept of a continental breakfast, which is a continental breakfast is a light and insubstantial breakfast, maybe consisting of a coffee and a croissant, and this is contrasted with a English breakfast, or in Scotland they call it a Scottish breakfast, and in Ireland they call it an Irish breakfast, which is made of all these life-threatening fatty objects on the right-hand side. So this doesn't actually correspond to the distinction between continental and analytic philosophy, because you would think, if anything was a heavy, indigestible philosopher, it would be Hegel or Heidegger, for example, whereas if any philosopher had the lightness of touch of A.J. Ayer or Donald Davidson, say, then this would be the continental style. So the breakfast doesn't really help us, but we know what the distinction is, so to speak, in extension. You have analytic philosophers, and there's almost to this conference it's redundant to read these names out: Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, Quine, Austin, Ryle, Putnam, Lewis, Kripke, Rawls, Anscombe, Foote, McDowell, Brandom, and so on and so on. And the continental philosophers, of course, you have Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Marcuse, Adorno, Levinas, Derrida, Foucault, Lacan, Deleuze, Christophe, Badiou, and so on and so on. And I think most of us would be fairly confident in assigning philosophers to one group or the other. We may think there are certain crossover figures or something like this, but on the whole, this is a division. But what explains the division? What are the ideas or the facts behind the division? This is my question. Some people make fun of the labels continental and analytic. Bernard Williams famously said that using these labels is like classifying cars as Japanese and front-wheel drive. One classifies in terms of some sort of function, the other in terms of origin. Actually, Peter Jews, who is undeniably a continental philosopher, pretty much refuted Williams's point when he said that this point is no more persuasive than the claim that a Danish pastry can't be distinguished from a croissant because croissants can also be made in Copenhagen. So I think Williams's point is rather glib and superficial, I think. There are different ways of labels can come in many forms, and they can classify things that are real, even if the labels aren't the same category. The origin of the labels is interesting, and I'm sure that many people know this, that the first published use of the phrase continental philosopher is from 1838 by John Stuart Mill. Mill wrote two essays, an essay on Bentham and an essay on Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the English poet, and who was also a Kantian philosopher. And he described Coleridge as the continental style of philosopher, who always asks the question, what does it mean? As opposed to the English style of Bentham, who asks the question, is it true? Now, there's some remote connection here to the current use of continental philosophy, as Simon Critchley points out in his little book on continental philosophy. But the point I want to make is slightly different, because it's actually rather like the first published use of analytic philosophy. If I think this is correct, but nothing really turns on it if it's not. But 1933, R.G. Collingwood, so the Oxford idealist philosopher, who really didn't like analytical philosophy and thought that analytic philosophy was the end of philosophy. He used the term analytic philosophy pejoratively to group together philosophers of whom he disapproved. Which is an interesting point that I learned from a recent book by a man called Christoph Schuringer, who's written a book called A Social History of Analytical Philosophy, which has some interesting points. But my point is not that this is the real meaning of the labels. It's rather, that is to say, the things Collingwood disapproved of and Mill's view of Coleridge. But it's rather interesting that the labels were first introduced originally as terms for the philosophical other, right? So for your opponent, you introduce this term, analytic or continental. Things change. These days, there's one big difference between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, is that most analytic philosophers typically are happy to identify as analytic. I'm happy to call myself an analytic philosopher, even analytic philosopher, and most of the philosophers I know, I think, are happy to call themselves that. Some people see themselves as being, I'm above all this. I'm much too sophisticated, and I despise these simple distinctions. But on the whole, my experience is that analytic philosophers tend to be happy to identify as analytic. But most continental philosophers would never, or did never, call themselves continental. And the significant continental philosophers don't do that. So the irony there is that continental philosophy, now that phrase, is typically used in Anglophone universities in Britain and the UK, I think maybe Australia, for programs devoted to the study of those thinkers who never describe themselves in that way. Maybe that's not surprising. Maybe that's often true of classifications like, early modern philosophers or medieval philosophers. Of course, scholastic philosophers would never have described themselves as medieval philosophers. So there is that. But those are historical classifications looking back, whereas continental philosophy is a thematic classification which applies contemporaneously. But I think it's a significant point that most continental philosophers don't call themselves continental. And so there's a little bit more of the despised other form of the meaning of the word than there is in analytic. So my third point then is whether this is a philosophical distinction. And of course, a lot has been written on this. There's a book by Hanyo Glock on what is analytic philosophy, where he attempts to define analytic philosophy and comes up with the view that there isn't really anything that all analytic philosophers have in common. You might think that there was some distinction in doctrines or ideas or topics, but this is clearly a generalization that probably isn't true, but nonetheless, it's sort of deeply true, if you know what I mean. It might not be superficially true, but it's deeply true that there's no real cluster of doctrines or ideas which are common to all analytic philosophers, and that aren't also shared by some uncontroversially continental philosophers. The second way of dividing the traditions would be to say that there are distinctions in methods. But this is hard to maintain too, because analytic and continental philosophers both use conceptual distinctions, arguments, appeals to authority, interpretations of previous philosophers, counterexample, and so on. It's not to say they use them all in the same way, but the notion of a philosophical method is really not so robust as to be able to withstand this similarity. So I think the similarity it's very hard to make a distinction in method here. We have various myths about the origins of analytical philosophy, which sometimes people use to explain the tradition. There's the idea that analytic philosophy began in Cambridge with the revolt against idealism by Russell and G.E. Moore. But there's also the idea that analytic philosophy began in Germany, in Jena, with Frege's logic. And in the case, and Michael Dummett has put forward the view that Frege put philosophy of language at the heart of philosophy. This view is not widely accepted these days. Actually, André Leclerc mentions that Pierre Jacob has pointed out that analytic philosophy was born twice, in Cambridge and before that in Germany. There's also the idea that the fundamental origin of analytical philosophy was in Vienna with the Vienna Circle, because that introduced the idea that philosophy and science were closely allied to one another. This is a very hard view to maintain as well. Similarly with ordinary language philosophy of the 1940s, 1950s. Yeah. As for continental philosophy, since no one really wants to own continental philosophy except in a rather slightly resentful way, no one really says, I mean, people say continental philosophy goes back to Kant, and some people call continental philosophy post-Kantian philosophy. When I taught in the University of London many years ago, we had a degree program where we taught various parts of the history of philosophy, and no one wanted to use the label continental philosophy. I think perhaps because they were too fastidious about terminology, or because they didn't like those people called continental philosophers or something. But instead, that part of the degree program was called Post-Hegelian Philosophy and Phenomenology. As you can imagine, this was rather hard to sell to students when telling them which courses they should take. And since they didn't know even who Hegel was, then they had to take a course on post-Hegelian philosophy and phenomenology. So the origin stories are not convincing. There's also the normative or the stylistic stories, which you often hear with analytic philosophers, particularly when they're left to talk on their own. They will say analytic philosophy uses argument. Continental philosophy doesn't use argument, they just use rhetoric or something. Continental philosophy emphasizes literary style, analytic philosophy does not. Analytic philosophy is clear, continental philosophy is not, and so on. I don't think this is a serious way to think about it either, not just because of the details of concepts like clarity, and it's just not true that analytic philosophy isn't interested in literary style. It's not true that continental philosophy doesn't use argument. But the most important point is that if we're going to make sense of this distinction, we should be able to describe each side of the distinction in terms that they themselves recognize. So, if some people have the view, that analytic philosophy is rigorous, clear, making progress, and continental philosophy is bullshit. If people have that view, then they're hardly going to be able to engage in a dialogue with people who think continental philosophy is worth pursuing. It can't be part of their concept. They need to think of the distinction in another way. So put that to one side too, and then if we go into the particular topics, then we find very little that we can actually pin down as necessary for analytic philosophy. And here I'm relying on people like Bloch and what they've said about this, and others too. The idea that analytic philosophy is based on logic or logical analysis, and in brackets I just mention someone who actually has said these things. It respects common sense views. It takes its lead from science. It believes in objective truth. I mean, many analytic philosophers believe in that, but believes in systematic philosophy, for example, metaphysics, and in philosophical progress. So David Lewis was someone who believed in that, for example. And many. These views are common to many philosophers, but they're not necessary. You can find analytic philosophers who reject each of these ideas. I say all. Maybe I meant to say each of these ideas. You can always find someone who rejects one of them, and continental philosophers who also accept some of them. I recommend, for illustration of this, a wonderful piece by Jonathan Ray called English Philosophy in the 50s, which you can find online in the journal Radical Philosophy, where he there talks about a book edited by Gilbert Ryle, which was called The Revolution in Philosophy. And I think this book came out in about 1950 or something. And it had all the analytic philosophers of the day saying how there'd been a revolution in philosophy and how they describing the particular parts of the revolution. But none of them could agree on what the revolution actually was. Was it logic? Was it Russell's logic? Was it Frege's logic? Was it science? Was it the verification principle? Was it positivism, or was it ordinary language philosophy, or was it the linguistic phenomenology of Austin, or was it something else? Russell's analysis of logical forms, for example, and they couldn't agree on all this. So there was a sense that there was some sort of movement here, but there was nothing that all the members of the movement shared. On the other hand, there's also Adrian Moore's book, The Evolution of Modern Metaphysics, which is a magnificent book, has a lot about continental philosophers who accept these ideas about metaphysics and the ways of thinking. He has interesting chapters on Deleuze and Derrida who accept some of these points. So I think a lot of these points are very familiar. Similarly, there are some cliches about continental philosophy, that continental philosophy is more concerned with the question of the possibility, the nature of philosophy, more concerned with real-life questions of human life and existence, is more historically oriented, sees deeper connections between philosophy and literature, is more politically engaged, and maybe challenges all assumptions. Is a kind of skepticism of the sort that you find in Derrida's early work. But again, these aren't sufficient, and they're not necessary either. But because you can find analytic philosophers who accept each of these ideas. So there's this jumble of ideas, and described, some of them just the same idea described in different ways. So, for an example, I would say Derrida's, the way I understand Derrida's critique of the metaphysics of presence, what he calls the metaphysics of presence, I just understand that as skepticism about intrinsic intentionality. That's the way I would put it, which is a view which is held by perhaps one of the most analytic of analytic philosophers, who was Quine. Of course, Quine didn't believe in meaning or in intrinsic intentionality or intrinsic meaning. Quine and Derrida have this thing in common, I believe. Maybe in your project you've also gone over these themes of differences and compatibilities and the difficulty of drawing this distinction. I'll just say one more thing about method, though, and I guess I'm kind of skeptical about the idea of philosophical method as a subject matter, even though I think there are methods that we use as philosophers. I don't know that we could define a method of analytical philosophy or the method of continental philosophy. One thing I would notice about method, and this might be method or it might be style, and maybe there isn't a sharp distinction between method and style, is that continental philosophers tend to proceed by giving readings of other major philosophers. So I'm sure that everyone's come across this on the analytic side. If you say to a continental philosopher what you're working on, I say I'm working on intentionality, and they say, "Oh, are you working on Husserl?" And then I would say pedantically, "No, I'm working on what Husserl was working on." But that's a difference in style, where you give a reading of you pursue philosophy by giving readings of other major philosophers, and then that raises the interesting question of which philosophers are those you give readings of, and which are the philosophers, the foot soldiers, the worker ants who do the readings of the great philosophers. And how do you become one of those people? How do you become Badiou or Rancière or Lacan or Deleuze? How do you become one of those people as opposed to being one of the people who does readings of those people? That's an interesting question about the hierarchy of philosophy, and particularly in post-war French philosophy, I think. But Germany is different because there's always been a tradition, of course, of systematic philosophy in Germany, where you're not actually studying texts or doing readings of other people, but you're pursuing the systematic questions. Analytic philosophy tends to address questions more directly, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it has its own cult of personality too. the cult of personality, this is what Schrödinger says in this recent book I mentioned, The Social History of Analytic Philosophy. The cult of personality manifests itself in the fact that certain philosophers set the questions. So you can address a question directly. You can say, in this paper, I'm going to address the question of whether any collection of objects comprises a third object, another object, so whether any collection of objects comprises a whole. And you want to ask, well, why are you asking that question? It's because certain influential philosophers who you respect and who you were taught put the question on the table. And that can be partly, perhaps rather cynically, described as a cult of personality. Schrödinger's book is very cynical, by the way, and that's not the best bit of it. So there isn't a distinction in method, I would conclude. So you might say, is there really a distinction? Is there such a thing? Maybe it's the case that analytic philosophy just is philosophy, and continental philosophy maybe is a confused and non-rigorous attempt to do philosophy. That's what some people think. It's just all my PhD supervisor, Hugh Mellor, he said that all good philosophy has always been analytic. A remark that's hard to square with the idea that analytic philosophy was invented in Cambridge in the early 20th century. All good philosophy has always been analytic is a comment about style and the collection of problems rather than about the historical period. A more ironic approach would be to say that the traditions are both asking the same questions in different ways. And sometimes you find analytic philosophers saying this, that they'll say, well, I don't know about this other tradition of philosophy which asks these same questions but uses different terminology, or maybe asks different questions but just uses different methods or something. So there's that sort of approach. I think it would be good for analytical philosophy to reflect on this situation, because I think actually, as a matter of fact, it's obvious that there is a distinction. So, sorry, no is an answer to the question: are these traditions asking the same questions in different ways? Is it true that all good philosophy has always been analytic? No. It's not true that there's just philosophy, right? I think it would be perverse and disingenuous to deny that there is a distinction between analytic and continental philosophy, that there is a real distinction. But I want to say, and philosophers should accept, that not all real distinctions are philosophical. That is to say, they're not all distinctions in philosophical method or philosophical ideas or doctrines. They might be something else. And so there's another way, I say, to think of the distinction, and this is what I'm going to talk of next. Okay, so in explaining what the distinction is, I'm going to draw on a conception I have of what philosophical tradition is. And this is a rather deflationary conception. It's a historical conception or historicist conception, because I say that a philosophical tradition is no more than a historically connected series of canonical philosophical texts, plus a way of reading those texts in the light of the central questions of that tradition. So, of course, this looks circular, and in a way it is. The idea is that the tradition creates the questions, tradition builds questions, and the questions may come from all sorts of places. They may come from within the tradition or outside the tradition. They may come from, scientific discoveries, or they may come from religious ideas, which are hard to distinguish from philosophical ideas. And then you have a series of texts, and the texts, over time, are responded to by other texts. And the people who are reading these texts read them in different ways. Read them in a common way as part of that tradition. And they read those texts in the common way in the light of the central questions. I'll give an example. I mean, for example, the case of Frege. Since Frege was, some people say Frege was primarily a mathematician and not a philosopher at heart. He just had philosophical ideas, but his main work was in mathematics and in formulating his logical system, which was a system for mathematics. So if you think that, then you have to ask yourself, I suppose, why is it that there are questions which we trace back to Frege, like the question of the distinction between sense and reference, between Sinn and Bedeutung, these Fregean distinctions, or the notion of the proposition that we take from Frege, what he called a thought. These ideas emerge because of a focus of the tradition on those questions, and they take Frege as Frege is one of the canonical texts. So the texts of Frege that are canonical are on sense and reference, the thought, function and concept, and Begriffsschrift. And these are the maybe the foundations of arithmetic was. I think these are canonical texts within analytical philosophy. But those texts are they're the canonical texts because they're the questions that the tradition has chosen to focus on. Another example, if you take Kant, for example, and Kant is a canonical figure in analytic philosophy. Not that he was an analytic philosopher himself, but the history of philosophy is traced as coming from Kant. Kant is an important figure along the way. Certain works of Kant's are more central than others to the tradition of analytic philosophy. The Critique of Pure Reason is a central text, and then the Moral Philosophy. Kant's Critique of Judgment is less central for analytic philosophy. But in certain parts of continental philosophy, the Critique of Judgment is an absolutely canonical text. So why is that? Well, it's because it's this intersection between the questions that the tradition is focusing on and the works that are taken to be canonical. So this is why I say central questions emerge in a tradition because of which early texts were being read, and plus extra textual factors and circumstances like science and religion, and if those are distinguished from philosophy. So I think the upshot of this, I would say, is that there is no set menu of questions. There is no list of problems of philosophy of all time. There are no what David Armstrong calls compulsory questions on the philosophical examination paper. That's a mistaken vision of things. The idea to think that there's this set of problems which go back to the Greeks, and maybe they're present in other traditions too, and then cross-cultural philosophy is a matter of identifying when those questions appear in other philosophical traditions. I don't think we should think of it like this. We have to think of the questions as historical constructions from the canonical texts, and the ways of reading those texts are reading the texts in the light of those questions. So I think this idea makes sense of the analytic continental tradition. Those are the canonical texts of analytic philosophy. I won't read it. There are some of them. I won't read them out. The canonical texts. Continental philosophy, of course, is much, much broader because it's not a natural kind in any sense. There are many traditions which fall under the continental tradition, but there are canonical texts within those traditions. And traditions can diverge and split depending on which texts are treated as canonical. So I have an example there of Kant's Third Critique, and Nietzsche's Denial of Morality. So the Genealogy of Morals has become as almost canonical text in analytic philosophy, but it's read in a very different way, as I believe, than the way that it would be read in other areas of Nietzsche studies. Now, the good thing about this approach is deflationary, and it's not philosophical in the sense I'm not saying there's a philosophical essence to these traditions. This approach explains two things: why the two traditions have very little that unifies each of them, philosophically speaking, but why there is nonetheless a real distinction. There are these overlapping streams of canonical texts with the way that they're read, and they sometimes interact and they sometimes diverge. And I say no other approach explains the distinction. I can't prove that, but I think this approach explains the distinction, and I don't think any of the other approaches are very good. A case study here, I think, is Husserl is an interesting case, because Husserl's early work is shaped by the influence of Brentano, of course, and the Brentano school. And of course, there was a big difference between the concerns of Austrian philosophy and German philosophy, actually, in the 19th century, which has led some advocates of analytic philosophy, like my friend Kevin Mulligan, to fly the flag for Austrian philosophy as the origin of analytic philosophy, or not a part of the origin. Bolzano, Brentano, and the Brentano school. And it's obviously right that the concerns of these philosophers, Brentano's concerned to distinguish the mental from the physical, even though it's framed in a very different way, and he gives a very different answer than people give today. These are perfectly intelligible concerns from the point of view of analytical philosophy. The question of intentionality, mereology in Husserl, of appearance and reality, these are equally concerns of analytical philosophy. So you might say, well, does that make Husserl really an analytic philosopher? And I say, well, in my approach, that's a bad question. There's no such thing in a sense of being really an analytical philosopher. Being an analytical philosopher is about your place in a tradition. So it's a relational property. Husserl counts as a continental philosopher these days, perhaps because he was later interpreted by his former student Heidegger and by Derrida, for example. Derrida's first book was a study of Husserl. So you might say, if there'd been no Heidegger or no Derrida, Husserl would have been an analytic philosopher, and that would have been perfectly fine. Whether someone fits into the tradition, into a particular tradition, is a matter of what comes after, just as a matter of what comes before. So, now my final comments then are about broadening out from this particular proposal about analytic and continental philosophy to talk about the role of history and philosophy, the history of philosophy in philosophy. And here I know that Andre has made some comments on this, which we can discuss when I finish in a few minutes. So this question, why does history of philosophy matter to philosophy? I think is a good question, because the question is not why study the history of philosophy, because the history of philosophy is part of our culture, and studying the history of our culture is something which doesn't require any general justification. Right? You may think that it's more important or more interesting to study certain parts of the history of culture than others, but studying the history of philosophy is just studying part of the history of culture, and that's not what's at issue here. The issue is, why is it relevant to philosophy itself? And sometimes there are two bad answers, I think, sometimes you find. One is what I call the prophylactic approach, that you should study philosophy of the past so that you don't make the mistakes of philosophers of the past. There are a number of things wrong with that. One is that that's not actually the way we do it. That's not actually the way we study it. It doesn't really make sense of the way we try and get inside people's views. And another is that there are so many mistakes. It's so hard to know how you could possibly conduct a study of the history of philosophy, pointing out all the possible mistakes that you could make. I mean, one thing here I would like to point out is that a standard approach to thinking of history of philosophy in the analytic tradition, if you're not doing scholarship is one, and scholarship, in fact, in analytic philosophy is very high quality now. certainly since the 1950s and 60s, the basic scholarship among philosophers, what's expected of a history of philosophy scholar, is much more demanding than it's more like real history than it used to be. What it used to be was that you were given the texts of the philosophers of the past, and students were given their text, and then the obvious errors in these arguments were pointed out. So, Leibniz, for example, we're told Leibniz was a brilliant philosopher, and then we're also told, well, actually, the problem with Leibniz's view is that his metaphysics could not accommodate contingency, because it was part of the individual notion of a substance that all the things that were true of them were actually true of them. So it was part of the notion of Julius Caesar that he crossed the Rubicon. So we couldn't say it is, that is to say, it's part of the substance himself. We couldn't say that Julius Caesar might not have crossed the Rubicon, because that wouldn't have been Julius Caesar. Now, the thing is that this is an interesting puzzle, but there's something even more puzzling, which is, if Leibniz was such a genius, why couldn't he see that point refuted his whole system? What was it about his system that stopped him from seeing that? And of course, interpreters then agonize about this from the point of view of our perspective. But there's a better way of thinking of this, which I will mention in a minute. So the other bad answer is because the great philosophers were so great, right? And that they were such great guys, and they had such great ideas, that we need to really kind of hang out and absorb some of their greatness. To be frivolous for a minute, this really is the view you find among ancient philosophers. They just say, when they would talk about I've heard people sitting around and they would talk about Aristotle as he. They don't even need to mention who it is. They won't say it's not the anaphoric use of the pronoun. They'll just say, I think what he's getting at here is, and of course, in the prior analytics, he says, so such respect is paid to these great geniuses. And of course, these are great thinkers, and it's important to read great thinkers. But I think this doesn't explain why we read people whose ideas cannot make sense to us, even whose ideas don't ring true, won't have any ring of truth for us. Who could believe in Berkeleyan idealism these days? I mean, some people do, they're occasional people. But that's clearly not why we're reading Berkeley, because we might have missed some nugget of truth in his idealism. So, why is, if these two answers are no good, why study history of philosophy as part of philosophy at all? And this is my answer. I think that the history of philosophy helps us understand the questions we have by looking at how the traditions develop historically. And helps us thereby understand the nature of the questions themselves. And I think happens in two ways. You see that once you understand how the positions emerge through the readings of texts in a tradition, that the range of positions available as answers to the question is created by the tradition in the sense defined in the series of those texts and their interpretations. So you have the tradition is creating the questions, and it's also creating what counts as a suitable answer, or an answer you can take seriously, or an answer that's part of the debating scheme. So I'll give an example in a minute. But the second point is that the questions themselves are posed only in terms of their place in the tradition. So perhaps that should have been the first point, because the questions, that is the important thing. The questions arise only because of their place in the tradition. And what counts as a plausible answer to those questions then emerges in this way. So go back to the example of Leibniz. I mean, I think that the way to understand Leibniz, of course, Leibniz is a very complex philosopher because he wrote so many things and his views changed such a lot. But a way to understand this question of contingency, it seems to me, is to see that for us, from our perspective, and here I'm talking about, 20th century, 21st century analytic philosophers, we accept contingency. Contingency is just the fact of life. We've all come to accept it, that there just things happen and things could have happened otherwise. So for us, what needs to be explained is necessity. And necessity is a puzzle. It's a real puzzle, how there can be such a thing as mathematical necessity or metaphysical necessity or conceptual necessity. How can there be these necessities in reality? Broadly speaking, Hume has had such an influence on the way of thinking in analytic philosophy that this is the natural starting point. Necessity is puzzling and contingency is not. But of course, for Leibniz, it was the other way around. So if you really believe that God created the world, and then on that and a few other assumptions leads you to the view that the world must be the way it is, and also that it must be the best world. But if you really, really genuinely believe in that, then God wouldn't have done otherwise. Then that's the starting point, not contingency. And the thing you have to then explain is what people mean when they say things are contingent. And Leibniz had a complex explanation of that. He had a kind of reduction of contingency, if you like. And that view, I'm not saying that view is correct. It's just that if we understand it in terms of what his starting assumptions are and what the texts he was reading were, and where he's coming from, then we're going to do better to understand why he had the questions he had and we have the questions we have. And that helps us understand those questions better. So my final example, and then I will conclude, is the question that I've worked on a lot, which is the question about the relationship between mind and body. And sometimes this is posed as if it was a natural or intuitive question. And particularly now, these days, in the discussion since David Chalmers and others, and that the specific way in which the question is posed in terms of the qualia or phenomenal consciousness, this is supposed to be some kind of intuitive question. It's supposed to be intuitively puzzling that a mere material being could have states of mind with qualia or phenomenal consciousness. Now, in my experience, this is not an intuitive problem. I think there are intuitive problems in philosophy, but I think you have to get people into the mindset to think that there's something puzzling about what phenomenal consciousness is. And normally to get people into the mindset, you get them to read certain texts, and some of these texts are very powerful and impressive texts, and then people start to feel that there is this problem about putting consciousness into the physical world. But often the way that the question has then been set up is so complex, and it seems so inescapable that there are only 3 possible solutions, or 2 possible solutions, that it's very hard to see how to get out of this mindset. And I think the way to get out of it is to understand how this whole question, phrased in this way, has arisen. And I've written a paper on this, on the history of the mind-body problem in the 20th century. And my conception of this relies crucially on behaviorism, and that behaviorism was very influential in the mid-century. But behaviorism didn't deny consciousness; it just said consciousness isn't anything that can be dealt with by science. Then, when people started talking about consciousness after behaviorism, they kept the basic structure of thinking there's all the stuff that contributes to behavior, and then there's this thing on the top, which is the thing that can't be dealt with by science. And they just called that the problem of consciousness. But so if you want to get out of this mindset, this is a whole different subject for a different talk, a different paper. If you want to escape this problem, then the best way is to look back at the history and look at the steps that were taken in the past, which got you into this position of having to face an unanswerable question, or having to take seriously views like panpsychism. So this is why you can't just jump into a philosophical question and just assume that the question is going to make sense. It would be a bit like turning on a drama series, a long-running drama series that happened every week, that been running for 20 years, and trying to understand how all the characters are interacting just by looking at the current episode. And this is an example that I got from Daniel Dorr. I think, and maybe a more pessimistic example is that philosophy is like a bad marriage that's been going on for 2,000 years. And if you walk into a marital argument that's been going on for 2,000 years, and you hear them shouting at each other, you're never going to figure out what the real question is until you look back at all the mistakes that have been made along the way and all the previous arguments. So that's a more negative image of it. So then I want to draw a conclusion from this. So my conclusion is perhaps somewhat surprising. So I want to say that the analytic continental distinction is not a philosophical distinction. That's my main point. It is a real distinction, and we need to understand it. The distinction should be understood historically in terms of a constructed series of philosophical texts, together with the ways of reading those texts. That's important. But we can then begin to understand why one tradition approaches certain questions and another tradition approaches other questions. And in this way, we come to understand those questions or problems better, I believe. So ironically, I think understanding the analytic continental distinction historically can also help us understand the problems of the two traditions better. And that's my speculative conclusion. I can't say I've established that in some sort of deductive way, but that's my conclusion about how to make sense of these things. And I'm drawing here on some work I did some years ago on philosophy and its history, and there are some other papers on my website there. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Tim Crane. So we're going to proceed to comments by Professor Andrea Leclerc from the University of Brasilia. Thank you so much, Professor Leclerc.
Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Hi, Tim. It's good to be in touch with you again, even separated by thousands of kilometers. Last time I saw you, you didn't have children, didn't wear glasses, and you did something quite heroic. You left Barcelona, took a plane back to London, just time enough to change your shirt, and then took another plane to Fortaleza. The next day you gave a talk, and the day after took another plane to give another talk at Rio de Janeiro with Marco Rufino, and then back to London. Well, and you survived.
Those were the days.
That was heroic. A good example of British courage, as Robin Hood would have said. Of course, this is a fictional assertion. Okay, I confess I have a hard time to find a unity in continental philosophy, the so-called continental philosophy. So I will focus more on analytical philosophy, and as I agree much of your approach to philosophical tradition, I will give an example and then discuss some issues on the relative to the analytical tradition. Okay, so we are running out of time, so I will read my text. It will be the best way to have some time after for a discussion. Well, there are many similarities between the treatment Tim Crane proposes for philosophical traditions and what happened in the philosophy of science from the second half of the 1950 decade until today. No instant rationality was a popular slogan at the time. Scientific ideas need time to show their value, and they always belong to something bigger than a simple conjecture or theory. Expressions like paradigm, scientific research program, Lakatos, research tradition, Loudon, were put in circulation. I believe that philosophical traditions, mutatis mutandis, were worked much in the same ways. I think Tim Crane captures very well, in a concrete way, the idea of a philosophical tradition, more specifically in the case of analytic tradition, avoiding too vague descriptions like analytical style or analytical spirit. Moreover, Crane's approach most of the time resolves the problem of establishing the beginning of the tradition with the idea of canonical text. My suggestion is that a philosophical tradition must present something new and promising at the start, and to show some strong continuity in the production of its most inspiring contributions. I can give you a pretty good example of a philosophical tradition in the sense presented here by Tim. In my academic formation, I studied philosophy of language and mind in the analytic and phenomenological traditions. Then I got interested for my doctoral work in the uproar triggered by the publication the same year, in 1966, of Chomsky, Cartesian linguistics, and Foucault's Les mots et les choses. As a member of a research group on illocutionary logic, I decided to study the treatment of the illocutionary aspects of meaning, which those aspects that determine when an utterance should count as an assertion, an order, a promise, a question, etc. In the tradition of classical universal grammar. The tradition started clearly in 1660 with the publication of Grammaire générale et raisonnée of Port-Royal, Grammaire de Port-Royal, by Claude Lancelot and the great Arnaud of Port-Royal. Arnaud was a great metaphysician, a great logician, a great grammarian, a great theologian, and a great philosopher. So this is why Louis XIV, the 14th, called him the great Arnaud. It was quite enduring research tradition that lasted over 150 years in France and England. I soon identified the locus of that treatment, the treatment of the illocutionary aspects of meaning. It was to be found in the general theory of verbal moods as the main illocutionary force indicating the device. The universal grammarians also consider the tone of voice, the situation if you are speaking with hierarchical someone who is a superior in the hierarchy, and or someone who is a subaltern. It makes a difference. So elements of the context were taken into account. Then I identified the main text and authors of that tradition. In France, after Arnaud's Grammaire générale et raisonnée, the philosophical grammars of Claude Buffier, César Chesneau-Dumarsais, Nicolas Bouzet, Condillac, and Destutt de Tracy. In England, they are all called James. James Harris, James Burnett, James Beatty, accused by Hume of being a bigoted zealot, and James Gregory, a close friend of Thomas Reid. Some are rationalists, like Arnaud and Bouzet, some empiricists, like Dumarsais, Condillac, Destutt de Tracy, and others common sense philosophers, like Buffier, Monboddo, Beatty, and Gregory. By appealing to Lakatos' methodology, I reached the conclusion that the tradition of classical universal grammar is independent of the epistemological doctrines of the time. It has its own hardcore and protective belt, shared by all the grammarian philosophes, independently of their epistemological creed. In addition, and this is important, all the texts of this tradition refer explicitly to the Grammaire générale et raisonnée as the beginning of the tradition. So we have one single tradition develop the main ideas of a canonical text. All the universal grammars approach natural languages much in the same way, trying to explain what is common to all languages. Here is the novelty, and there is a continuity in the tradition. By that I mean that there is no great interval of time between two meaningful publications of philosophical grammars. The speculative grammarians in the Middle Ages, the famous Modist, already had the intention to explain the facts of language based on the universality of ontological and epistemological categories. But they worked on Latin only and in Latin. The same holds for the Latin grammarians of the Renaissance. The most famous is Sanchez, but there are many other, the Italian, Jules César Scaliger, the British grammarian Lineker, Vossius, Scopius in Germany, but they all worked on Latin, in Latin. Well, but the idea of explaining what is common to all language is new and started with the Grammaire générale et raisonnée. I believe that all this matches perfectly Tim's description of a philosophical tradition. As to the question of the treatment of illocutionary aspects of meaning, answering it requires a systematic analysis of the modes of the verbs, then of the theory of the verbs, of predication, grammatical proposition, judgment, and other acts of thought. So we must go deeper and reconstruct a large part of the whole theoretical background of the tradition to answer the question. Well, I studied the famous Summa Tucius Logicae with one of the best specialists of Occam's works, Claude Palacio. Claude was my teacher in many disciplines, and he is an enthusiastic analytic philosopher. I remember a paper he published with the following title, La philosophie analytique au Moyen Âge. Prima facie, the idea makes sense, or so it seems to me. But we are told that the contemporary analytic tradition started in England in opposition to the British neo-Hegelian philosophers, or, like Pierre Jacob once put it, that analytic philosophy was born twice, once in Germany with Frege as a central figure, and in England with Russell and Moore. If this is correct, and no doubt it is, how could there be analytic philosophy in the Middle Ages or at any time before the end of the 19th century? However, the distinctions made by Occam in his Logic of Terms put the theory of reference, at the time called suppositio, at the center of his project. And that theory has been taken seriously by the late scholastics. Buridan's studies of paradoxes, sophismata and insolubilia, is another example of how the analytical spirit or style, especially the concern for language and logical questions, is present and strong at the beginning of the 14th century. The same holds for Buridan's Tractatus de Consequentis, which sounded surprisingly modern for historians of medieval philosophy in light of the contemporary reflection of the same topic. Duns Scotus' subtle metaphysical distinctions are now discussed again today in the metaphysics of modern logic. So, philosophy is not a doctrine, rather it is an activity, as Wittgenstein said in the Tractatus. Conceptual analysis is a central instrument in the endeavor of clarifying thoughts. The term conceptual analysis appears in almost all descriptions of the analytic movement, but it has been in use since Socrates. When hearing people pretending to know what justice is, or virtue, or knowledge, Socrates approached and started asking questions with the intention to show that the definition proposed was neither necessary nor sufficient. The pre-Quinian style of conceptual analysis presupposes analyticity, which was submitted to criticism by Quine in his famous Two Dogmas. I strongly agree with Tim that Quine's argument is not deductive, that it is rather the presentation of a seducing new way to look at meaning, analyticity, and other matters. My diagnosis goes like this. Quine was the most radical empiricist ever. Classical empiricists adopted the ideational theory of meaning. Locke said, the meaning of a word is the ideas in the mind of him that uses it. So, but the problem is that ideas cannot be seen, observed. This is an infraction to the empiricist principle. Quine distrusts conception of meaning like the ideational tradition, as well as meanings conceived as set theoretical constructs. So that distrust extended to related notions like analyticity, necessity, and synonymy. Strawson and Grice gave an answer soon after. The notion of analyticity is understandable, it can be thought, etc. Kaplan defined analyticity independently of necessity. The sentence, I exist, is always true in any context of use, hence is analytic. But it is certainly not necessary. Model logic, especially applied quantified model logic with essentialism, developed at a good pace in the last decade. Quine two dogmas was in the hand of analytic philosophy, not even of the end of old-fashioned analytic philosophy. Frank Jackson considers that conceptual analysis is a matter of intellectual responsibility, but Quine opened the way to something that has been called scientific pragmatism, with Sellers and himself as leaders. Unfortunately, it gave rise to a variety of scientism. In the Vienna Circle Manifesto, we find a description of the historical background where the authors, Carnap, Hahn, and Neuhardt, acknowledged the influences of many philosophers of the past, Hume, Kant, Leibniz, and even Epicurus. They use expressions like the spirit of the Enlightenment. We can use similar expression for the analytic tradition and talk of the spirit or style of analytic philosophy. But these expressions are too vague to characterize a tradition. Analytic philosophers put logic and the philosophy of language at the very center of their philosophical project. This intellectual strategy is combined with a respectful attitude toward scientific knowledge and a general down-to-earth and sober style of philosophizing, even in ethics and metaphysics. But nothing of this is new. We saw that the same concern for logic, language, reference, paradoxes, and conceptual analysis were present well before the end of the 19th century. It does not come as a surprise that such an attitude and philosophical style, described in general terms, appeared in different moments in the history of philosophy. But that is not enough. We need, as Tim says, canonical text to mark the beginning of a tradition, and there must be continuity among the main contributions, as a strong similarity in the approach and treatment of problems. Now, when did the analytic tradition begin? What's the novelty that characterized its debut? I think that the advent of mathematical logic was quite decisive. It was a source of enthusiasm, palpable in the works of Wittgenstein and Carnap, and represents the main novelty of the analytic tradition. Dammit considered Brentano and Husserl alongside Frege as important sources of the analytical movement, and of course for the phenomenological movement as well. Chisholm would have no doubt agreed with that. The reception of Brentano's work in England was extremely positive, more than Husserl's work, especially after the transcendental turn of 1913. Anyway, analytic philosophy started soon after Frege and Russell's works on mathematical logic, and the continuity of the movement is undeniable. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andre. Yeah, I just make a couple of comments. I mean, I agreed with almost everything you said. I think I like the examples very much. One thing, the example of Arnaud and the general grammar, I think is a very useful example for me, because that's a way of thinking about language which has gone very deeply in analytic philosophy, and it's very hard to, and it's produced many great things, and bits of it are very hard to dislodge, and there are people who want to think in other ways about language, in some way, so you can distinguish in some ways in thinking about language about a sort of between one approach that takes as a model the idea of a perfect language, and in which you find Leibniz there definitely, and I think, and then also Frege as well, but although Frege was thinking less about language, and then moving right on even to Chomsky, when you see that there is something that the language is this system, that there is an ideal language somehow, and which gets messed up in the actual speaking of it, and that's a very dominant vision, I think, in analytic philosophy. And I think it's interesting to think what other visions of language there are. And I think actually in continental philosophy, those who are interested in ambiguity, wordplay, obstacles to the systematic or ideal conception of language, they're attracted. It's more like a temperamental attraction to things like that. People who like reading Derrida, people who enjoy reading Derrida, enjoy spinning out all the complexities rather than looking for the sort of order that you find in someone like Arnaud. So, and that's so, yeah, the rather crude picture I was painting has to be modified, I think, to account for differences in temperament like that as well. Arnaud is a really interesting case because it's like when you read him, I think if you read for example, in the correspondence with Leibniz, or in the objections to the Meditations, they're so incredibly clear by our standards. It's just like reading a contemporary philosopher. So there really is that. It's amazingly one of the clearest, so much clearer than Descartes or Leibniz, or even Leibniz, definitely. So it's really interesting that there is such a thing. You can see it. It's what we value as a sort of precision of verging on the pedantic, but it's very good. And so that's how I make sense of the two ways I would make sense of the idea of analytic philosophy in the Middle Ages, which is, I think, another really good example, and is that obviously it's not a historical claim, but it's somehow you can identify common themes treated in a similar way, and that's definitely there. And it's but also this thing that we find in Arnaud, and which is a certain kind of limpid style, and yeah. The only thing I think I'd just like to make two other points, if I may. One is about modal logic, because I think this is very important, and actually I think modal logic as a way of understanding necessity. I mentioned that necessity is the puzzle of our time, in the sense that for Leibniz, contingency was the puzzle for him, and so I think you're absolutely right. The attempt to understand necessity and therefore possibility in terms of logic was given this boost by the invention of modal logic, and I think it's become absolutely central, independently of the logic. Now it's become central to analytic philosophy, I think, necessity. And if you think of the importance of Kripke and Lewis and these ways of thinking, and the whole way of how to understand both the natures of things, the essences of things, but also how to understand the laws of nature, for example, and how those relate to the concepts of necessity. And actually, so here I would put in a good word for this book by Schrödinger, this Social History of Analytic Philosophy, because even though I don't much like the social history bit, I think that doesn't really work. But he puts in the center of the development of analytic philosophy, he puts the idea of necessity and modal logic, and he shows how central that is to so many things in analytic philosophy. And I found that very illuminating. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, of course, it relates because of the connection between meaning and modality, which was then important to Carnap and then to Quine. And Quine rejected them both. This relates to the central mission of analytic philosophy in terms of the analysis of meaning, if you want to think of it that way. But so the only thing, and my final comment is then, I think your remarks at the end indicate how the diversity of origin stories means that analytic philosophy really conceptually fragments in a certain way, because Dummett can't be right. I mean, Dummett's book is only called Origins of Analytic Philosophy, I suppose, as opposed to The Origins of Analytic Philosophy. But Dummett can't be right that this is what's common to all philosophy of language. That philosophy of language is the heart of philosophy, and early Wittgenstein and Russell can't be right that philosophy is about the logical analysis. So, but nonetheless, historically, those were two very important, as you say, to the beginnings of the tradition. So the tradition may have had many beginnings, and that's fine. As long as you're not looking for an essence of the tradition, that's all. It's all fine. But the important thing is to understand it. Thank you very much for those comments.
Okay, thank you. Do we have time?
I don't think so. Professor Crane,
Yeah.
we actually we are basically on your tight schedule, so
Yes.
we normally would proceed to Q&A sessions, but we are totally up to you.
I have to. Yeah. So my schedule was that I have to leave to pick up my daughter from school.
Yeah. We are aware.
In 10 minutes. So if we could have 10 minutes, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be very happy. Yeah,
okay, maybe one question. Yeah. We do. So I think we do have a time for a really short question.
Yeah.
Okay. So do we? Okay.
A short comment on your observation, your remark that there are other ways to look at language, and you mentioned the search for an ideal language in the tradition of Leibniz, Lambert, and then a partial realization in Frege and Russell. In the tradition of universal grammar, you find people like Antoine Deschutes de Tracy that defended that universal grammar can apply also to algebra and mathematical languages. So universal grammar should have the categories rich enough to give an account of ideal languages. And Husserl, in the fourth logical investigation, defend the project of universal grammar. He quotes explicitly the Grammaire générale et raisonnée, and the idea of independent meaning and dependent meaning gave rise to what will be called the categorical grammar in the Polish tradition. And then categorical grammar was used in the tradition of ideal languages. But the ideal language, certainly at the beginning, was an epistemological project. In the discussion between Descartes and Leibniz, Descartes said, we need the true philosophy to find the lingua caracteristica. And Leibniz, and so we can use the lingua caracteristica to find the true philosophy. So it's at the beginning, at least, an epistemological project. But Thank you for your remarks.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
We have a question.
No. I don't think we have time.
Do we?
No. Once again, Professor, thank you so very much for your outstanding lecture, and we hope we can have you here in person in the next time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I'd be delighted to come. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.